Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us again on the Seafood Matters podcast. You can help the series by pressing subscribe and share it with family and friends. Joining us again today is Mike Park, OBE, Chief Executive Officer of the Scottish Whitefish Producers Association. Hello, Mike. Welcome back to Seafood Matters.
Good morning, Jim. Hope you're well.
Thank you. I am, as I hope you are. Before we get going, please tell us about your career and the path that brought you to the Scottish Whitefish Producers Association and the role you play, who you work with, and where you travel. Takes you in the job.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, that's at 66 years old. There's quite a story there now, to be fair. Yeah, so I was brought up in a small seaside village at the time, 7,000 of a population called Stonehaven. From the age of 6, I stayed at One Shore Head, which, I guess the clues in the name. It was right by the seaside. So from the early age of 9, we used to have, me and my friend used to have a little creel boat, make our old creels over the winter, and then work them in the summer. And from there, I progressed to working on some of the 40-foot sea netters during the school holidays. I used to do 6 weeks on there. I used to get like £1 a week, I think it was. It was my uncle's boat. And eventually, I moved on to the larger boats in Aberdeen. But when I was 11, I actually spent 6 weeks aboard a vessel called the Ocean of War, which was a great line vessel that used to operate at Fairbank and Rockall Bank and various other, Bill Bailey Bank would be another one. So I spent 6 weeks there, and the reason that I ended up there was, or how I was allowed to do it, was the fact that my father thought it would sicken me of the sea and put me off forever. But obviously that didn't work. So I then progressed on to the larger boats in Aberdeen during the summer holidays, eventually leaving school, going to the Merchant Navy as a sort of promise to my mum that if I got my O-levels and that, I would do something different. Spent one trip there in the Far East, came back and got a job in the top boat in the UK at the time, which was the Argonaut. Spent 7 weeks aboard there and then moved, because I was only relieving for one of the crews ashore. I then moved on to a vessel called the Helene, which was skippered by Billy Malcolm. And I spent, I think it was 3 years there until I sat my mate's ticket. I then carried that same vessel when I was 20. I got my own vessel called the Jazzarine 85-foot sea net when I was 25. I then built, and when I was 21, I had my first boat. When I was 25, I built my first wee boat at Millers of St. Maurice, called the Nebula. Likewise, it was 87 feet long. Then after that, we used to pair with a vessel called the Dauntless, and he wanted out, so we bought him and his quota. So I operated 2 vessels at the time, eventually decommissioning one of them. And then by that time, I was starting to take a keen interest in the politics of the industry through my local branch, which was a member of the Scottish Whitefish. And eventually I become chair of that, and then I become vice chair of the SWFPA, then chair of the SWFPA, and then we morphed through executive chairman and then chief executive. So I've been there for a lot of years, and it hasn't been a meteoric rise to where I am. It's very much been an incremental stage as you learn your trade all the way along. And, even now, Jim, every day is a school day, and I'm learning something new all the time. Traditionally, the fishing side of it takes me to places like Oslo, Brussels, London, Edinburgh, Tórshavn and Faroe. It's part of the annual negotiations. But also within Scottish Whitefish now, we have a crewing company that brings in crew from overseas, and to make sure that if fishermen are bonded or they're not subject to bad practice, we routinely audit our overseas agencies. Where we can't find agencies overseas, we create our own, which means we have to spend a bit of time overseas in places like the Philippines, Sri Lanka, India, Ghana. So the job is very much broadened over all these years, and it's not what it traditionally was. And that's just the crewing side, was created because obviously there were some bad stories coming through. And my whole in life, as I was explaining to someone here this morning, is to look down the track and see what's coming at us that could harm the industry, to find a solution to the problem so that it doesn't hit the industry economically or in any other way, Jim.
Mike, if you don't mind me asking, I think, could you explain it? We're obviously hearing a background noise, and I'm not really making an apology for it, but I would think it's very much the person you are. What's the background noise coming from, and where are you?
The background noise here just now, Jim, and yeah, I've tried to find a quiet space. The Responsible Seafood Summit is on the go just now, and I'm a member of the steering group, the Global Seafood Alliance. And there's a presence here this week where they're talking about human rights. And obviously, with the company we've created, the Scottish Whitefish, many people are looking at us now as being exemplary in that field. So I'm here this week actually talking with other leaders around the world who are putting similar systems in place, and also to give a talk on human rights at sea, why it's important.
Well, I would just like to tell our audience, I think it says so much about the person you are. You're out there in Colombia, you're in an important business and conference, and I called you yesterday. I says, how do you fancy we have a chat about the situations that are coming up just now, and you made yourself available for the very next day. So I think it's good for our listeners to know that, how available you are for the industry and your members. So, yeah, but maybe start and ask you, how is the fleet faring this year?
The fleet is done. The fleet's quite resilient, and it's done. And when we talk about the fleet, it's a generic sort of term we use, but it's very much made up of different sort of sectors. The scallop sector is having a difficult time, both because it's been displaced from its major fishing areas down in the channel. The price of the product in the market's not that great, and it's displaced into an area where the yield was low. So the scallop sector is really having a challenge in an area. And of course, high costs, like everybody else, is impacting on that bottom line. Then we move on to the nephrops sector, who have found nephrops in more abundance this year. So they've had a reasonable to good year. But of course, like everything else, there's a tipping point in terms of price and in terms of, what's lying in the cold stores. So we're now finding the prices coming back with the nephrop sector, which, will hit the bottom line moving forward. Whitefish sector, as resilient as ever. It charges on. Prices of good big fish have been excellent. Prices of smaller fish, not so. Would hope that will stabilise going forward. And in the whitefish, we are finding the catches of some stocks reduced as well, which may be impacting on gross yield. But overall, apart from perhaps the scallop sector, the majority of the industry has done reasonably well this year. Although, as I mentioned previously, it is suffering a bit from increased costs.
How are the cod stocks on the grounds? What are your members seeing?
The cod stock on the ground seems to be less abundant than it was previously. Our members are hunters, and they know where to go and hunt. And if they want to target cod, they have the ability and the experience to go and target. So in the places where there are cod, there are still abundance of cod. But I think what they're seeing generally, what they're relating to me, is that in general, in other areas away from these hot spots, there seems to be less fish cod on the ground. And that's where we sit down with our international colleagues, and some of them are saying the same as well, that they're seeing less cod on the ground. So there is an understanding that things are probably not as good this year as they were in the previous year in relation to catches of cod. But the scarcity is making the price grow because I noticed in some of the market reports that last week that large cod was reaching £8 a kilo, which for a 40 kilo box, you do the maths, that's £320 a box. That's a good price.
Do you think measures that you've introduced in the past, such as spawning closures, have helped?
An interesting question, Jim, because we introduced those a way back. I think it was in 2006, 2007. And that was to allow us to draw back some days at sea from Europe, if you recall, that they introduced to try and rebuild the cod stocks. I think, if I'm honest, it has played a big part in the recovery, or some part in the recovery, because letting a fish spawn, once more before you catch it is bound to be a good thing. But I think it's probably a collective of many things. We decommissioned over 170 vessels between 2001 and 2003, so that set the scene to be able to deliver a recovery. I think the closing, the grounds that we have during the spawning season is equally uh, helped the situation. And I think generally some of the members just trying to avoid cod because they didn't have access to quota has probably also helped as well, as long as some positive environmental factors. So I think there's probably a number of things that have come together to allow the cod stock to begin to rebuild itself. But like everything else, Jim, you do within that rebuilding, you do get annual fluctuations that we need to deal with almost on a real time basis.
Indeed, indeed. How are you viewing the recent northern cod advice from ICES?
With some frustration. And I don't think it's about the advice. We know, as I just said, the fishermen are saying there's less fish in the grounds. But it's this headline advice that ICES feels compelled to deliver, which is suggesting a zero catch of cod. And the trouble with that, in my eyes, Jim, is that ICES says that in isolation of other measures that could be put in place to protect the various stocks. Because as you'll remember, and some of your listeners will maybe recall, we treat the cod stock differently now. It used to be West of Scotland cod, North Sea cod, but after the recent benchmark, we now have three sub stocks, which is Southern, which is down South North Sea, Viking, which is off Norway, and then the Northwestern stock, which encapsulates the West of Scotland. And it's the southern component that's not doing very well. And you'll probably find that's not through anything to do with fishing. That's about environmental factors, and it's about climate warming and the warming of the seas. And in fact, I think it was Carl O'Brien did a paper that suggested that the centre of catches of cod was moving northwards at 12 kilometres annually. So we know there's a shift away from there. But ICES in its approach to try and protect and rebuild that southern cod stock has basically said zero fishing or zero catch of cod. And because there's an unknown degree of mixing between the other two stocks and it, they suggest as well that there should be no fishing there on the basis that if you fish up there, you may catch a cod that comes from the southern component. Now, the chances of catching a cod, west of Shetland that started off in Heligoland is quite remote. I think that's a frustration for me and my members that why take that ultra precautionary approach and apply it to the two northern stocks when chances are you know the risk of mixing is low and the likely impact on the southern storm of catching a cod west of Shetland is probably remote. So with regard to that, it's frustrating. And the frustration is manifested, Jim, because we live in a world where the green NGOs go on the attack quite regularly. And in ICES making that sort of statement of zero catch, it sets the bar extremely low for managers. Managers are out there to take a decision based on not just the abundance of the stocks or the sustainability of the stocks, but the socio-economic factors as well. It says that in the Fisheries Act and the Joint Fisheries Statements, the managers can do that. But when you get ICES coming out and saying there should be no catch of cod at all, immediately that puts pressure on the directors and the deputy directors within the departments and trying to protect their ministers. So whereas you may come to a decision on the output, that decision is very much, the sort of tonnages involved in that decision are under stress because it started from a very, very low bar of zero catch. And that's our frustration. ICES doesn't have to do that, but it does it now year on year, which is making life difficult for everyone.
That's for sure. Could selective fishing or seasonal closures or things like that do more than zero catch ever could?
I think as a sort of progressive industry and an industry now that understands that long term management of the stocks in a sustainable way is best for them because the people that are left in the industry are very much focused on the medium to long term, and rebuilding stocks is something that's foremost in their mind. I would always suggest there's more we can do to protect the stocks. What I would guard against, Jim, and is trying to do something between now and the end of the year to try and get a reasonable tax set for cod. Because if you try and move in that direction too quickly, you will get things wrong. And I think what I would suggest is that we set a reasonable tack, taking account of the socioeconomics and the need to continue to protect stocks, whilst using next year to try and work out in terms of medium to long term planning and strategic approach what we should do, not just us as an industry, but what the European industry should do to try and protect and cover, once again, the cod stocks. So yes, there's more that can be done. We can analyze as well the current seasonal closures we've got in place. I know the Norwegians put in real time closures or seasonal closures during the year to protect small cod. So there's obviously more that we can do, but we shouldn't plan that now in response to a zero tack of cod. Because remember, we only have 3 months between now and the end of the year left, and we will not get it right.
Does ICES headline advice for zero catch cause confusion with the industry?
It does cause confusion because, my members realise that the landing obligation still exists. It was transposed from EU law into UK law. And the landing obligation says that, where you have no catch of species, then that fishery has got to be shut down to try and protect it. And that means you would shut down every other fishery that's connected to it. And that's my interpretation. And I'm sure it's the right interpretation. So, in saying what it's saying and ignoring reality, both political and social, ICES is basically saying you should just shut the North Sea down. You should just not fish it for next year and then allow the stocks to recover, unless you can find a way to fish without the threat of catching cod. So it does cause confusion because the fishermen see less cod in the sea this year than they did last year. And as we've seen in previous years, that's been the case. You get these annual fluctuations. But to suggest you should shut down a fishery just because you see slightly less fish in the sea is not the response that at this time they would expect. So yes, it does seed a lot of confusion, and it takes a lot of explaining from people like me and other industry leaders as to why that's come about and what we need to do to try and counteract.
You know, Mike, I know I was talking in a recent podcast with a man I know you know very well, James Anderson in Shetland. And I thought he made an excellent point about that, got it across really well. I was asking him about this sort of same sort of thing with fish taking off and less of it. And as he says, just read John Goodlad's book on the cod hunters. And he says, back in the 1800s, they were going out to the Papa Bank and they would be getting good catches, then not so good, and fish would be taking off. And and that was with hook and line. So in the 1800s, that was happening, and they were taking off, but they were coming back again.
Yeah, I mean, annual fluctuations are created by a number of factors, and yes, fishing, removal of fish from the sea is one of the factors. But it can be a number of other factors. It could be predator prey factors. I mean, just now we have a massive whiting stock in the North Sea, the biggest ever reported, I think, same as haddock. And whiting's a very voracious eater of other fish stocks. So could it be the impact of that? There's a number of factors that could be at play. But I don't think you need to shut down fisheries to manage them appropriately. There's different ways to accommodate that. By all means, let's reduce the tack, but you can put in a stability clause there to make sure that it doesn't, overly impact the industry in an economic way while balancing recovery against that. So yeah, and James is right. James is a fisherman I've got an utmost respect for. I've sat with James in a number of committees, and everything James says always hits the mark. And I think he's right on this occasion as well. That you know fluctuations in abundance of stocks from year to year is something that has existed in the past, will always exist, and we need to be grown up enough to respond to that in a sensible way.
Indeed, indeed. Do you think zero catch is science or politics or a bit of both?
I think it's a bit of institutionalized sort of responses. I mean, ICES has its own internal procedures about what you should do if a stock goes below BLIM reference point. And in recovering it back to where it should be, they're suggesting you should have no fishery on it. And then the ultra precautionary approach, they just roll out to the other stocks because of that exit mixing element that I talked about earlier. So, ICES is pretty much caught in its own trap. It lays out these approaches, which it says you have to apply. And I don't know how you break free from that, to be fair.
Does the advice energize the green NGOs and the environmentalists.
It certainly does energize the green NGOs. Not that they need any energizing, to be fair, but when you have a respected organization such as ICES suggesting, for whatever reason, that there should be no catch of a particular species in an area, immediately, immediately that causes concerns for them, and it allows them to put pressure on ministers, etc., to try and maintain that position. And that's why I'm saying that earlier that trying to get a sensible output at the negotiations is going to be difficult because the fishery ministers know that if they get it wrong or the managers get it wrong, then they could end up in court, and their officials will be desperately trying to keep them out of court while trying to deliver a sensible and balanced output for the industry. So, yes, the answer to the question is it does energize them to have a go at the managers in a way that they think is credible, which is a difficulty for everyone.
On the ICES, like, how do you feel about their credibility? Because going like almost, I would describe it like a roller coaster from the high to the low. It's no way to manage fisheries. But when I hear this zero catch, it reminds me of 100 cod left in the North Sea, seas emptied by 2048. 90% of the tuna in the world have already been caught. It just, to me, it goes into that category. Just
Yeah,
baloney.
and then to counteract that, you see in terms of hake, northern hake, you see the greatest recovery since Lazarus. The biomass of hake shot through the ceiling. Yeah, I mean it is very difficult for the industry, and when we talk about a discredited ICES, we don't talk about the people involved in the process because they're all very, very clever and normally open to discussion with the industry. And of course, we get observer status and more now in terms of groups, more now than ever before. But you have to question some of the output by ICES because it was just last year that they recalled the cod advice because they made a mistake. And here we go this year. The advice should have come out at the end of June, but it was then delayed until the 23rd of September. So there is a number of things going on that actually breach the confidence of the industry. You expect ICES to run like a well-oiled machine, and in some respects now it's not doing that, which makes us, in terms of industry, sit back and take notice and think, what's going on? They've set up now a tiger team to look at the cod stock issues, the modelling. That doesn't deliver confidence to an industry. I guess there's confidence there that they've sought it, required, so they've responded. But in terms of why they responded and why they needed to respond, doesn't give us confidence at a time when we we do need confidence in some areas of policy making.
Definitely. And it must make it difficult for managers to come to a balanced position on the matter.
It is. It's, I mean, ordinarily, you just look at the stock and what you need to do to protect the stock. But when you get massive shifts for zero advice, you maybe look at the secondary advice that the ICES gave was for a 51% cut. If you do allow fisheries to be in another deep appearance, a 51% cut. It makes life difficult for everyone because remember, cod is one of a number of species that fish together. And then it makes you think about how do we deal with the other species in that fishery. We've always applied some degree of mixed species, mixed fisheries approach, but it's always been on a single stock issue or a single stock sort of approach to it. So it does make life difficult for the managers, and it does make life difficult for the industry as well, because it's very difficult to create a position in terms of what you want your managers to deliver when faced with a starting position of zero. It is very difficult for the industry to come up with something that is credible that the managers can latch on to. And essentially, through the Northern Fishing Alliance this year, that's what we've sought to try and do, is come up with a position that protects the industry economically, but it does enough to protect the stocks and recover the stocks going forward, albeit on a different timeline. It doesn't suggest, the position we're adopting should recover the stocks within 12 months, but what it does do, it puts it into a holding pattern so the economics can continue while giving yourself space to try and put something together in terms of a forward-looking strategy.
Are we risking the future of the Scottish fleet by sticking rigid rules rather than any flexibility and evidence-based management?
We are risking. I mean, the industry will be along for a long time yet. And what you do is you do put certain individual operators under stress. If we look at other key commercial species for next year, you're looking at ling down 30%. You're looking at saithe down 24%. You're looking at other species down as well, such as lemon sole. And if you piece that together, that is £100 million loss to the North Sea demersal sector. That is quite a
Yeah.
significant loss in any one year to any sector. And of course, that's just a broad brush, calculation of tonnage, average cost, and everything. But it's like anyone to argue as to why such a loss of income doesn't put a sector under stress. It does. I think that's where, we need the support of our government in this issue, that they don't just blindly follow ICES advice, and they don't accept some of the green pressure, and they do understand that industry stance on this in terms of finding a position that delivers both sustainability of the cod stock and economic viability is the sensible direction to take. And obviously, we'll be lobbying hard both through the Northern Fishing Alliance and individually to the UK government, Scottish government, to try and get common sense to prevail.
Do you feel the shore side should maybe come into it a bit? Because when you're talking there, it's taking me back to things like the herring ban in the North Sea and a full ban rather than a reduced catch. And when it come back on, there was no market left. So is there a danger if there's that much cuts and quota, just say for next year? How do we keep our market and our processors?
Yes, it's always very difficult, isn't it? And we do know that there's countries out there that can supply cod into the UK, and they do it very successfully already, both from Norway, Faroe, and Iceland. So the less we catch, the more opportunity it gives other countries to export into us. I mean, that said, that shouldn't be a reason to abandon sustainable practices. But at the end of the day, if we know this is just going to be seasonal or annual and the cod will come back and we can rebuild it, then I think there is a duty to acknowledge the responsibility of the managers to the industry. And we do have a good rapport with the managers, both in Scotland and the UK, and they understand our position on the matter. And I'm sure they will try and develop a position for their ministers that meets our requirements to some degree. But I guess we will have to wait. There's two trilateral rounds of negotiations scheduled so far, Jim. And that's the UK, Norway, and the EU, obviously, for the jointly managed stocks. But it may be that it goes beyond two rounds because they just can't reach agreement. And with some of the issues going on in the pelagic sector now, I'd imagine that most of the meetings will be taking up discussion pelagic issues, and then notwithstanding the cod's important to us, these other issues will have to be resolved before they even get onto code, I would imagine.
Indeed. Do you see how leaders set in their stall as we move to the negotiations?
It's been difficult this year. I mean, through the Northern Alliance, Jim, we always try and reach consensus and try and set out a stall that everybody agrees to. I mean, this year has been difficult because it's very easy to come to a common position when you're talking about the size of an increase. It's very difficult and a very different nature of discussion to set out your stall and how big a reduction should be, because that's not natural for fishermen to suggest a reduction in their opportunities. But if we do take into consideration the scale of what's being proposed, and we do take into consideration the empirical knowledge that we have that there is less cod this year than last year, then I think we do have a duty to respond in a way that allows managers to hang their coat in our peg. And essentially that's what we've set out to do. Some others take a different view, and they don't reckon that fishermen should suggest a reduction at all. but everybody's got their own opinion and everybody's got their own members to lead at their discretion. So yeah, this year's been more difficult than most, but in terms of the Northern Alliance, we've managed to hold it together and create a position that we think is credible going into that negotiations.
Have you any confidence that there might be a sensible outcome? Do you see it possible?
Uh, Good question, actually. We know that it won't go to zero cash, and we know that probably we wouldn't get what we would ultimately like. But the position the fishermen have maintained going into this negotiations is not about adopting a position that we would like. It's about trying to mitigate the damage that could be done. So do I think that we will get what we want? I don't think we'll be far from it. But it would be good to think that the managers could ignore some of the pressure that will come from the Greens to base a position on the socio-economic needs of the sector without reducing the biomass of the cod stock further.
Yeah. Do you feel the managers have the appetite?
Managers have got the appetite. I mean, cod is iconic. I had a discussion this morning about, why should we be protecting cod above any other stock? Say, hake, ling, dust, blue ling. Why should we focus out cod for that special protection? And I guess the reason is it's featured in a number of books, like John Goodlad's books, but also it takes on its own iconic status. And I think, we'll never manage to walk away from that. But as I said previously, I think what we need to do is get over this year and into next year, take a deep breath and sit down as a responsible industry with the managers to try and work out what we need to do going forward in a way that it gives us the latitude to harvest everything else at the same time as protecting cod. And that's not an easy task, but it's one that I think we'll have to embrace next year and get on with it.
Indeed. Are there other measures that could be introduced to help deliver a reasonable output?
In terms of this year, I don't think there's much we could do. Obviously, we'll have to keep a keen eye on the other species that we catch alongside with the cod, such as hake and fighting and safe and others. We're introducing a new feature catching policy about how we go about catching our species, Jim, and there'll be things in there like square mesh cod ends and everything that would help ultimately at the end of the day release the juvenile cod back into the sea without being removed. I don't think there's much we could do between now and the end of the year, whether it be spatially, whether it be technically, because the chances are you'll get it wrong. You will get it wrong, and there'll be all sorts of unintended consequences. And that's why I would ask for time to create anything we think we need to do throughout next year, not necessarily this year, because that's when you get into all sorts of traps.
I like your cool approach. It's impressive. What do you say to policymakers who just follow ICES advice blindly without consulting people like yourself?
They always consult us on a range of issues, and we as an association have our meetings, and we come to a list of priorities that we see for the end of the year. And we have meetings and lobby on those positions, whether it be whether we want to enter into agreements with Norway of Faroe, or if we are going to put all our eggs in a basket in terms of negotiating capital, what should that be? Should it be cod? Should it be anything else? So, we always do sit down with them and try and discuss the tricky areas where they normally follow advice as in areas whereby it's not going to impact us. If they suggested a 10% cut in haddocks for next year, no one would argue with that because there's headroom, whatever. So they do, follow blindly the advice in cases where it doesn't have an economic impact or it doesn't set a precedent. But there are other areas where it obviously would create difficulties. They do acknowledge those difficulties and do link with the leadership and the fishermen separately to make sure that they get it right, because they don't want to be accused of not listening and not getting it right either. But to the same extent, they do have a minister to protect, and ultimately the sustainability of the stocks is in their hands as well.
Is the current science-based management system actually helping cod recovery, or?
But the current science-based system in terms of the benchmark of cod and everything, I mean, whether that should have been done with the uncertainty that remains in terms of mixing or whatever is up for question. I mean, who knows? It may be had that benchmark not occurred, we could still be facing a zero tack of cod for next year. I mean, just no one knows that. But I think there is an onus on ICES to make sure that it does get things right and doesn't recall evidence, and I just wish it would walk away from this headline advice that it feels it has to give, because they give it in the absence of other management measures that can be put in place to protect stock. So there's a number of things out there we need to look at, both in terms of the industry's response, the manager's response, ICES going forward, how it should produce its advice. And I guess all that will wash out in time, Jim.
Do you feel anyway that maybe this zero, can doubt highs and lows? Do you feel there's a bargaining position in it?
In terms of this year, Jim, I think the only bargaining chip, as I see it, is that the two northern stocks are in a better position than the southern stock, and the southern stock is the only one below B length. So the bargaining chip would be that we need to take a different approach to the northern two rather than the southern two. So that's in there. But also there is the bargaining chip of how much harm are you willing to allow the sector to come to? Because if we get this wrong, it will have an economic impact. And when you marry that with the reductions in other species, as I mentioned previously, it could be a severe impact. And then there's the unintended sort of outputs of all of that. What would happen if the fleet does significantly reduce strength next year? What if? And what if after that as well? What happens after that? How do we respond to that? So the bargaining chips are few, but hopefully the industry, through its meetings in the Northern Fishing Alliance, has balanced everything that we think has been at play, and that the managers could move towards our position, just as they did last year for setting the tack for this year. We hope we get the same respect we did then to our position this year. But I understand it's going to be difficult for managers, Jim. It certainly is. Because I say at the end of the day, they're there to protect the minister from harm in terms of ending up in courts, etc. And that'll be the foremost of their mind as well when they go into these negotiations.
Do you say in the past as well, when there's been drastic quota cuts like they're advising just now, do they work?
It's an interesting question. Do they work? They work to some degree, Jim. The landings obligation was never ideal, and it was a failed piece of policy making that we made people aware of and knew the commission when it was set. I mean, certainly the rapporteur for that was Ulrika Rodust, and I remember sitting in a room making her aware of the pitfalls of the landings obligation, etc., etc. It does alter behaviour. Does it alter behaviour totally? I'm not entirely sure about that, because once a fishing vessel goes out the harbour, he's his own master. But it does shape how much fish is removed from the sea. But it does need supplementary measures to make sure that these adjustments in TAC are adhered to, so that the stock does respond to that reduction in catches. And remember, proposed reduction in catches is a managerial response to a move in the biomass of a stock, and we all accept that. So yes, it does work. Could we introduce management systems that make it work more efficiently? Yes, of course we could.
Do you see this means for communities and younger people thinking about a career in the fishing industry?
Yeah, the disappointing thing is that, when ICES comes out with that headline advice, it gets airtime. So the coastal communities around Scotland will know what Scotland has said about the catches of cod for next year. And what it does do is it creates uncertainty, and it creates a negativity. So whereas just now through the Scottish White Fisherman New Building, we were looking to link back to the colleges and the schools to get kids involved, it makes it more difficult, because already they're seeing confusion, uncertainty out there in the workplace that they could be thinking of joining. And remember, less catches means less wages in our sort of business area. So it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. It would be fine if it was just the same each year. Obviously, that's impossible as well. But these large swings and the airtime and the focus it gets from the media is not a good thing.
Do you in any way see optimism because a way to protect cod stocks and keep Scottish fishing alive?
If nothing else, Jim, we're a resilient sector. I've been through, 1999 precautionary principle being invoked by the European Commission for tax and quotas came crashing down, and we shouted foul will put us out of business. We moved from 100 millimeter mesh size in the North Sea to 120. That was going to put us out of business. We've seen the days at sea regime that was going to put us out of business. So we're quite resilient in what we do, and we always try and find a response in a positive way. I think that's been borne out by the consolidation of the industry. Those that want to remain have a confidence in it, stay in it. It's borne by the closures we put in to protect spawning cod. And it's borne by the fact that there again this year, the industry itself is promoting a reduction in cod tax, taking everything else into consideration. So, yeah, we are an industry that will continue to evolve and consolidate, perhaps, but that's just a function of a modern day industry, and we'll always be here, albeit maybe in a different fashion. And like in the past, we will respond appropriately to the downward shift in cod abundance just now, and then we should come out the other end.
I love your confidence, honestly. How does ICES arrive at these numbers?
What I should probably do is display my hand here and say, look, I'm not a fisheries scientist. I understand, a number of things that they do with an ICES and how they collect their evidence. And basically, they count how much fish is in the sea in one year, assess what was removed during the year, and then come up with a biomass the following year, and then respond to that accordingly with a TAC. So it's to say it's simple maths is probably underplaying it. But at my level, I've got to understand the simple math, and whether they get it right all the time or not, I don't know. Whether it's a time delay in what they come up with compared to what we see in terms of our empirical knowledge, I'm sure that's the case. But ICES outputs are evolution of long time assessments. In some cases, 20, 30, 40 years. And there are trends there for everyone to see. Will they get it right all the time? Probably not. Will they have it, real time all the time? Certainly not. But it is the best that's there, John. And I think we just have to embrace that in our own way.
Do you think the science reflects what's actually happening at sea?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the science advice sheets, it does suggest that the Northern Sea stocks themselves do need a bit of help in terms of rebuilding. So they're suggesting there's less fish in the sea this year than there was last year. And that's exactly what the fishermen are seeing. The response in terms of zero catch is coming from their approach to the southern stock and then applying that out over, which then becomes slightly ridiculous for the fishermen. So in terms of their advice, if you peel it back and you look at each sub-stock separately, I don't think they're that much out of line with us in terms of our understanding. Where we are out of line with is the headline advice that we should be zero catch. So no, I mean, the answer to the question is no, I don't think there's much space between what we're seeing in the northern North Sea and what ICES has predicted to be its advice sheet.
But still, it's the way they arrive at it, zero catch. That's just over the top.
Yeah, they've taken their approach to the southern substock because of who we learn and suggested because of the threat of mixing to the other two stocks, then you should apply the same to them. And that's where we disconnect in terms of approach. We don't think that's necessary in any shape or form. And in fact, you can be more liberal in your approach to the two northern stocks than what they suggest. I say that's where the collision happens. But in terms of their assessment of the two northern stocks, that would suggest there's less fish in the sea this year than last year. And that's exactly what the fishermen are seeing themselves.
Mike, on that, I think it's a good time to close up. I would honestly like to thank you, in part on behalf of the podcast, making yourself available so quickly when you're in a different continent. I think it says a lot about yourself, and I think the whole industry should respect you for it. I would like to thank you. I really like your, what would I say, your you've been cool, you're not panicking. I can see that you've obviously been there many times before, if I was to go back with a question, it would be probably, how do you sleep at night?
Yeah, it's interesting. The thing is, with where I am now, there's a 6 hour lag in time. So yeah, I think I answered my first call at 2 o'clock this morning, which is not ideal, but it's it's a space I play in, so I have to do it.
Well, thank you very much, Mick. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.